That's huge.
And with that, we have, I think, our transition into the main topic, Herwig. We're talking about Securitize. I think it's time to hear a little bit more.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I teased you a little in the beginning there, but I think without further ado, I think we should jump into instant access. So I mentioned earlier, of course, that in the wake of OFN potentially delisting their security tokens, all of which, of course, are issued by Securitize, Securitize followed up and said, we have instant access, which will enable peer-to-peer transfers for security tokens, of course, issued by Securitize. Now, enabling an easier way to transfer your token directly to someone else is, of course, critical because this creates an alternate liquidity solution instead of having to rely on a marketplace or exchange to help match you with a buyer and then settle the transaction. So Securitize's instant access provides both compliance tools and the technology to enable a compliant transfer in regards to securities laws. According to the company announcement on their blog, they quote, say, once an issuer decides to enable the instant access feature, any potential buyer who has KYC AML approval from and is registered with the issuer can purchase the digital security from the holder if the holder has shared the transaction link with them. Only transactions that meet these KYC AML requirements and adhere to any applicable transfer restrictions imposed by the issuer via the DS protocol will be permitted. Now, let's break that down. For those of you who are consistent listeners on the show, you may remember our topic in episode 37 of investor whitelists. So you're already probably understanding what Securitize's instant access tool is really doing, by enabling essentially smart contracts to check KYC and AML status and check the whitelist status of an investor. The final component, though, in this transaction to actually work is what's called an atomic swap. And an atomic swap in this case is carried out through a link created by the instant access tool for the issuer to share, making it a rather easy investor experience. Again, I have to make this very clear that this is the issuer doing a direct transfer. This is not in any way Securitize acting as a broker or as a marketplace for the shares themselves. This is just technology being enabled to let the issuer and the owner manage their token. But specifically, Kyle, we kind of covered this on a broad scale, but we haven't covered the concept of atomic swaps in details before, let alone even mentioned it, I think. So maybe, given your background, maybe you could tell us a little bit more on how exactly those work.
Yeah, totally. So when we take a look at atomic swaps, it's actually a lot simpler than their name suggests. But I think that it may be helpful to add some context to look at a traditional financial transaction first. So when we have owners of two assets, they need to use a middleman to actually facilitate that trade. So for example, if we have investor one who sells stock A to the middleman for cash and then uses the cash to buy stock B. At the same time, we have investor two who sells stock B to the middleman, in which case she then uses that cash to buy stock A. In this traditional exchange, the middleman represents that centralized exchange, and that exchange takes a cut of the transaction for all their work. Alternatively, we could use smart contracts in addition to some complex hashing functions to essentially do the job of that centralized exchange programmatically, which allows two asset owners to effortlessly swap their holdings between each other, skipping the step of converting into fiat first, hence the name atomic swap. By skipping that step, investors no longer have to pay the bid-ask spread to a centralized broker. Instead, they can exchange their assets if desired in real time. This saves significant costs, especially in high-volume orders in larger transactions, which can save basis points on each transaction when rebalancing a portfolio, which is a very common occurrence in wealth management strategies. Atomic swaps enable swapping tokenized assets in a fast and simple manner, with an emphasis on tokenized, though, as this programmatic action could not work with traditional assets. The swap itself does not account for regulatory compliance, so in addition to the technology, Securitize has upgraded their DS protocol to create atomic swap capabilities for their tokens while enabling a smart contract compliance layer using whitelists and KYC AML as well as accreditation tools.
Got it. I think that makes a whole lot of sense. Thank you for breaking that down. Essentially, Securitize now has enabled using cryptocurrencies as part of their network to be able to transfer with each other directly using smart contracts. And I'm proud to say, actually, Kyle, that InvestReady, the accreditation software company that I founded back in 2013, is one of the providers of choice by Securitize for instant access. So that's really cool to see that we're helping power what I think, again, is something that is going to be very pivotal for security token issuers moving forward, knowing that this feature is available.
Exactly. I think that both firms play a crucial part in the process. And as we noted earlier, instant access is a very timely launch for Securitize because it coincides with this OFN delisting announcement, where all 5 tokens listed on Open Finance are actually issued by Securitize and are now under the threat of delisting. So by providing another avenue for liquidity, we should see a smooth transition for issuers as well as secondary market investors, because we don't know the extent in which Open Finance will continue operations and with which assets in particular. In a centralized exchange, in addition, each trading pair between 2 assets has its own bid-ask spread. So the exciting thing about an atomic swap and potentially seeing this scale into other liquidity providers and seeing this as an ideal opportunity for marketplaces is that when you have a bid-ask spread between 2 assets, it can be incredibly large when you have an illiquid pair. Right? If you have 2 assets that you're looking to trade between each other, it may not happen very often, so therefore there's going to be a larger fee for that trade. By leveraging smart contract settlement, we actually only have one bid-ask spread for each asset. It doesn't depend on which trading pair you're using, which allows for a much cheaper trade across the board. The only outstanding fees you're really paying are just the gas fees that power the smart contracts itself, which are very small. So atomic swaps is something that Securitize is now looking to pioneer, is something that I think really can catch on to other marketplaces and ATSs as well.
Fully agree, Kyle. Again, thank you for explaining just how important the atomic swap is as a capability for security tokens to be able to enable peer-to-peer transactions. You know, Securitize is one of the first and most funded companies in the space. They continue to lead the way. But I do also want to mention and highlight that Realty, another security token platform specifically focused on real estate right now. They've hosted all the real estate tokens that you can find on STO Market there. And they've really spearheaded this liquidity solution, I think, first. We've talked about on the show many times how Realty manages a whitelist themselves and uses Uniswap to power a peer-to-peer market for their tokenized real estate assets. And of course, that whole process uses atomic swaps as well.
Yeah, the only difference there being that Uniswap actually requires staked Ethereum to be able to power each one of those liquidity trading pairs, because as I mentioned, without that staked Ethereum, there actually is no one that can facilitate that trade. So potentially, even with Securitize's instant access, they're stepping that up another level by providing that full liquidity for any asset to be swapped without necessarily requiring that staked Ethereum. I hope that other issuance platforms will enable similar solutions as well to provide that immediate liquidity for their issuers, because this is a really great way to unlock those immediate options for investors, which drastically reduces the friction of adoption while providing a great use case for blockchain implementation across the board.
Yeah, and we have to remember, Kyle, secondary transactions for private securities happen all the time. They are just extremely cumbersome, they are manual, and they are slow, and they are far from digital. So that, again, I think this really puts a spotlight on the functionality of security tokens in general. Those of us who come from the crypto space, we already saw how revolutionary, and how lightning fast it was to be able to just transfer value using blockchain. But that's a tiny fraction of the population of the investors in the world who actually have never experienced this and don't understand what it's like to own an investment via a token, let alone the fact that this investment experience, as Consento pointed out earlier, can actually be digitized and live online. And so this is just an absolute game changer. And I hope all of you wonderful listeners now are able to understand how atomic swaps make transferring private securities digitally peer-to-peer a reality. Again, I really think this is going to be a major future. Every time one of these transactions happens, it is a new experience, an experience for investors to see what it's like to transact in modern finance. And I really think this is, smart contracts at its finest. And so with that, I think episode 41 can come to a close. So I want to thank you all for listening, and I hope to catch you next week.